Morning, everyone. Good morning. And welcome to Nourishing Black Futures, Setting an Anti-Racist Agenda for Food Justice and Black Maternal Health. I am Christine Platt, Managing Director of the Antiracist and Research and Policy Center here at American University, and I'd like to thank you for joining today's discussion. As a mother and Black woman living in the district, I cannot think of a more timely and relevant discussion. One of the core programmatic areas of the Anti-Racism Center is environment and health, because we believe that it is imperative that the travesty of disproportionately high Black maternal mortality be addressed in a holistic and urgent manner. I'd now like to turn it over to AU professor, Dr. Jessica Owens-Young. Dr. Young is an assistant professor in the Department of Health Studies at American University. As one of the center's faculty advisors, she has been instrumental in our work since the center was founded in 2017. Dr. Young's scholarship broadly focuses on health equity, including the effects of economic inequities and structural racism on Black maternal and infant health. Dr. Young, thank you for facilitating today's panel on the need to set an anti-racist agenda for food justice and Black maternal health.
Thank you, Christine. We are very excited about the conversation we are about to have with our panelists and you. Through this conversation, we will be making connections between two very important issues: maternal health justice and food justice. Often, folks working in these fields may not have opportunities to make important connections between maternal health, food justice, and anti-racism. We hope that today's conversation will foster new partnerships and set the foundation for an anti-racist agenda in maternal health justice and food justice. Thank you to all of the panelists for their participation, and I also want to thank Professors Garrett Grady-Lovelace and Professor Nina Yamanis for helping to plan and manage this event. Before we start, I'd like to outline some house rules. First, this event is being recorded. This event is also happening via Zoom webinar, which means that our audience's video and audio is automatically turned off. Audience members in Zoom can interact with the panelists via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you are watching via YouTube, please use the link in the description to submit a question for the Q&A. Live captioning and ASL interpretation will be available throughout the event. You can access the captions by clicking on the CC closed captioning icon in your toolbar. For those who would benefit from ASL interpretation, this service will be available in gallery view throughout the entirety of the event. And as you enter the event space, you are invited to participate in a poll so that we may get a sense of all who has joined us here today. This should appear as a pop-up in your event window. All right. Please also know that anyone who engages in harassing and harmful language will be removed. And of course, we won't be able to answer every question, so please thumbs up questions you'll like answered via the Zoom Q&A, and we will do our best to ensure the panelists answer those questions first. Also, if you are live posting about this event, and we encourage that you do so, please use the hashtag Nourishing Black Futures on your social media networks. Before we begin with the first question, I'd like to give each panelist a moment to introduce themselves, and we'll go in alphabetical order, starting with Dr. Goodwin, and then Ms. Marcelle, Dr. Reese, and then Dr. Wheeler. So, Dr. Goodwin, please take a moment to introduce yourself.
It is a pleasure to be with you all today and our audience. I'm Michele Goodwin, a Chancellor's Professor at the University of California, Irvine, with faculty appointments in law and medicine, public health, and several other departments. I am the founding director of the Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy, and I serve on the national board of the American Civil Liberties Union and on its executive committee. My most recent book is Policing the Womb: Invisible Women and the Criminalization of Motherhood.
I guess it's my turn. So hard to go after Dr. Goodwin. My name is Ebony Marcelle. I'm the Director of Midwifery at Community of Hope. I direct at a federally qualified health center that includes a birth center. Outside of that, I'm an activist with a focus on Black maternal health and serve on the following boards: the National Association to Advance Black Birth. I'm a collaborator with Black Mamas Matter, March for Moms, and do a lot of panels and education discussion about reproductive justice and maternity care.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Ashanté Reese. I'm Assistant Professor of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. I also have affiliations with anthropology and American Studies here. I'll talk a bit about my work later, but I am an AU alum. I got my degree in anthropology at AU and have done much of my research in DC. So thank you, Jessica, and everyone who invited me.
Dr. Wheeler.
Good morning. I'm hoping that you can hear me. My name is Beverly Wheeler, and I'm the Director of DC Hunger Solutions. Our role is to end hunger in the nation's capital, and we really do focus on the maximum utility of federal nutrition programs, and particularly for today, we're concerned about how we can increase WIC participation, because we do understand that early health, early food is really important to maternal health. So thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you, everyone, for those introductions. And so I'm going to begin with 3 opening questions that panelists may answer as it applies to their work. So the first question is simply this: what is food justice?
So this is Beverly Wheeler again. So what I would like to say, for us, food justice means people having healthy, affordable food. We also believe it needs to be culturally appropriate. And so we believe that that's it, where people have a choice. We do believe that being able to eat is a basic human right.
I guess I'll jump in a bit after Dr. Wheeler, who, let me just say, I'm going to address you directly, Beverly, that your work at DC Hunger was some of the earliest work that I found when I was doing my graduate work at AU, and I followed it a lot, particularly the studies around race and supermarket access that helped shape a lot of my dissertation projects. So thank you for the work that you've been doing in DC for quite a while now. I really personally appreciate it, and I know it's been important for the DC food landscape. So like Dr. Wheeler, I think, we think about food justice and access as one of the first things that comes to mind. And that certainly has been a frame that I've used in my work. And one of the things that I've been thinking about more recently is how the narrative around access that gets publicly deployed in some ways can lose some of the justice aspects, because we're thinking so much about the supermarket that really we are reinscribing people as consumers and not as whole humans who deserve to have what we need to have to live healthy lives. So I think about food justice, I think about it being more than just access. I think about the lives I want Black people to be able to freely live. And to be able to live a life freely also means to be able to nourish yourself in a particular way. And maybe that's something we can talk about as a panel, sort of the differences and nuances of access versus nourishment. What does it mean to actually be nourished, to nourish the Black body? in concert with the theme for today's panel. I think food justice too is also about having control over the means of production. It's not enough to have a supermarket chain just plop a new store in a neighborhood when community members may not have any say over how that store is managed, run, what is stocked there, et cetera. And then we also know that in the global food system, the large transnational chains are controlling a lot of not only just what we eat, but also has control over people's wages, which for me, food justice is also thinking about labor. Are people being fairly paid to do the work that they do? And we've seen that in the pandemic, it kind of has laid bare for us that people who are doing work in supermarkets, for example, considered essential workers. And a lot of those folks are going back to communities that have been wholly abandoned in some ways and are experiencing legacies of dispossession. So I think we have to think about labor, who's doing the work, how are they getting paid, how are they being nourished as well. And then I think I will just end with saying that to me, food justice also has and is inherently communal in a certain way. So to me, food justice is also pushing back against anti-individualism that is inherent in capitalism and is such a part of US American values, so that we can rethink what does it mean to not just access, prepare, and distribute food, but what does it mean to build community around food? And what does it mean to not just build community around food, but see that as an inherent responsibility that each of us have to contribute to that building together. So I'll just stop there.
And if I may just tag on really briefly, I see food justice as also being political and legal, and the questions involving it rooting back to antebellum and Jim Crow times in our nation. We can't really think about food distribution, nourishment, and justice without thinking about the injustice of Africans being kidnapped from their shores and being brought to the United States to develop food, to harvest food, to plant food that then they were denied the opportunity to be able to use to nourish themselves and their bodies. And I think it's worth us connecting those dots and connecting them politically to the era of Jim Crow, where there were so many African Americans who helped to actually fund the civil rights movement, but in the process of doing so, their farms were threatened, banks threatened to take their loans away that helped to underwrite their properties and so much more. So as we link these threads, I think it's important that we start threading the needle, looking way back at the foundations that were not such that they valued human life of Africans.
Indeed. Thank you so much for those holistic responses. And now I'm going to flip it and ask, well, what is maternal justice?
Well, I'll start there. So maternal justice can also be rooted back to the antebellum time too. Many people think about reproductive justice as a contemporary discourse, which was founded through African-American women coming together about 25 years ago and thinking about health as being something that was broad, if, when, how one would decide in order to have a child, not have a child, to be able to rear a family with dignity and care. But I actually like to think back about Sojourner Truth and that famous speech that many will record as "Ain't I a Woman?" And many people think about it as a speech that dealt with chivalry because she did address that. But more profoundly, and it's really interesting how history papers over this, she said in the 1800s, "And I bore 13 children, and nearly each one snatched from my arms, and nobody heard my cry but God. Ain't I a woman?" And so when we think about what maternal justice happens to be, there's something about understanding and appreciating, first and foremost, the personhood of people who become pregnant and their ability to live in dignity and to be able to flourish and be nourished during their pregnancies and thereafter, and not be surveilled by the state, not be criminalized by the state, not be civilly policed by the state, and to live in a sense where it is a government, it is a society that lifts them and their children up. And that's just the beginning of thinking about what maternal justice means. And let me just cap that with saying the following, that the United States ranks at about 50th, 51st in the world in terms of maternal health and safety. That means that in the United States, it's not guaranteed that if you become pregnant that you will actually survive your pregnancy. And for Black women, the data is even worse. Black women are nearly 4 times likely nationally to die during pregnancy than their white counterparts are. And that's a national figure. That doesn't account for states like Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, where the rates can be as much as 10 or 17 times as high as white women. So as a first, we have to be a nation committed to keeping women alive during their pregnancies. And if anybody wants to know who ranks higher than the United States, then think about Bosnia. Think about Saudi Arabia, countries that have been either war-torn with genocide or that have not had sterling human rights records.
Just come behind that to add, you know, thinking about, of course, everything that Dr. Goodwin said, but thinking about how a lot of the options for care are either under-resourced or inequitable. I like to talk about DC. I just spoke earlier today, talking about the tale of two cities, how we have one hospital that's extremely under-resourced, problematic, and reduced their care options. And then we have a hospital across the river that has a piano bar and a juice bar and a piano in the lobby. So we still have a lot of inequities in care. We have a lot of bias built in the foundation of medical education that affects how care is delivered. We don't have the strongest cultural congruency that we need to see in our providers. People need to see people that look like them taking care of them. And a lot of our systems are punitive and not patient-centered. So we have a lot to do as far as fixing and rebuilding, I like to say dismantling our maternity care system. And that's a huge piece of what justice work is, dismantling this very broken and terrible system.
Great. And what I'm hearing, you know, shared themes between both maternal health justice and food justice is this idea of personhood and seeing Black folks for their full human selves, which includes choice, going beyond access, making sure that there's cultural congruency or cultural relevance. So these are some of the ideas that I see shared across the meanings that you all talked about regarding maternal health justice and food justice. And so the next question is for all of our panelists. And I'd like to know how you define anti-racism and what you see the role of anti-racism in your visions of justice.
I'll jump in. Before that, Jessica, one thing I was thinking about as you were talking about the themes that cut across what we've been saying is really also self-determination. Like I was thinking about and listening to what was being said about maternal justice, I was also thinking about just the need, the desire, and the right to holistic care and being able to determine what that holistic care means for you as a pregnant person, for you as in someone who's part of a community of folks who are caring for pregnant people. And I think that to me also connects back to something that we haven't said explicitly, but thinking about the ways carcerality extends well beyond prisons, but become part of these structures and institutions that are supposed to care for us, right? And that in that care, creating systems of punishment, even in something like the birthing experience. So I think thinking about self-determination is an important part of what it means to feel good about having a birthing experience, and also what it means to think about caring for someone who is birthing or has given birth to children well beyond the birthing experience, the pre, during, and post part of those experiences, right? And how do people feel empowered? I don't necessarily love the word empowered, but how do people feel empowered to lead in their experiences? But to your question about anti-racism, so let me go ahead and just make my public confession that I really struggle with current practices of anti-racism. And part of my struggle is just watching how it moves, and in some ways moves from away from some of its more radical roots. And I guess what I want to say first is what I think anti-racism isn't, and then what I think it could be. So I don't think anti-racism is an enterprise or should be an enterprise, right? And seeing anti-racism basically become a market commodity has been really interesting to me. I think when we're doing anti-racist work, it is requiring it's not just an identity, it's not just a badge, it's certainly not just to teach me how to be a better person, but it is really grappling with structures. It is really grappling with how do we shift control. It is grappling with not just my personal giving up of things to make a better society, but a demand of the institutions and the structures that we're working within. So that's I always think about when we're doing this work right, we're not only giving up something, but we probably also aren't the most popular people in the room. So I mean, I think there's some temperature checks that we have to do around what does our anti-racist work look like in practice. That's the first thing. The second thing is I don't think anti-racism is a substitute for talking about the specificity of anti-Blackness. And so one of the things that I have been thinking about is how comfortable, and I talked to my students about this recently, so it's on my mind, what terms people feel comfortable with using. And by and large, people still have a hard time naming the specificity of anti-Blackness and how that's embedded. And it doesn't mean that anti-Blackness should trump us talking about other forms of racism, but we have to, going back to what Dr. Goodwin was talking about, these plantation structures, enslavement, all this, we have got to grapple with how that has built both the economic and social foundations of this nation, that this nation is built on theft of land, theft of labor, genocide, and slavery, right? And I think anti-Blackness means that we are literally grappling with that and how that shapes Black non-humanity, if you will, and how that shows up in these different spaces. And then I think the thing that I will say about what I think it can be, I think it can be a practice of shifting resources. It can be a practice and a praxis of shifting power. It can be a practice of really trusting, you know, we see these kind of phrases of trust Black women, for example, or whatever. And I'm like, okay, sure. But beyond this hashtag, does your trusting Black women also include you stepping out of a role of power and allowing someone else to step into that role to shape a wholly different future, right, for an organization or for an institution? In the work, in just thinking about food, one of the things that I've thought about a lot lately are the ways some of the most well-funded food justice organizations are also the least diverse in their leadership, right? What does that mean that we keep giving money to organizations and institutions who are doing work in Black communities and will not give money to Black folks to do that very same work, right? So I think setting an anti-racist agenda is also just thinking radically different around, I mean, you know, I'm going to use the term redistribution of resources, but it's thinking radically differently around who and what we fund and why, and being very explicit about that, right? And knowing that it's not necessarily, we have to rethink our measures of what success means. We have to rethink our measures of scale of success, all of these things that become bureaucratic barriers to people who are doing some of the most radical work. So to me, an anti-racist agenda is we redistribute resources, but we're also rethinking like things that are merit, right? Things that are so ingrained in us, right? To just wholly dismantle this idea that people do good work just because they can jump through the bureaucratic hoops.
I would add that these are questions that intimately relate to power, and they relate to structures. And even though the United States has been long exhausted with its origin story, clearly we haven't articulated enough about the United States origin story. And that leads us to thinking about what is it in terms of the psychological that our nation has struggled with ignoring. And, you know, if we were in a thought experiment such that we were in a movie theater and we collectively were watching 15 minutes of an auction cell of people, of little children and mothers, some people would probably say at 15 minutes, that's gratuitous. We've seen enough, that's really horrible. And we've yet not grappled with the fact that these are institutions that lasted more than 15 minutes, lasted more than an hour. If we found out in our town that somewhere there was an hour-long auction block with children standing on a table, nude, and their mother, cavity exploration, we'd say, how horrible, let's find out where it was, how in the world could this possibly be? But to think about a system that lasts not just a day, not just a week, not just a month, not just a year, but where people over and over again bid on human bodies and then justified it to themselves by saying, well, these aren't real people. These children are like little piglets and sheep because they're just property, they're chattel. And so are their mothers. These are not real people. Imagine then the psychological damage that's done by that. And not just to the people who are held on the auction block against their will, but also the people who have to delude themselves into believing these kinds of things. And this is where law becomes complicit. When law establishes the kinds of structures that allow for these things to continue on. When we create pathologies of people desiring to leave those systems, calling it a disease to want to leave slavery, that one is afflicted with drapetomania because you desire to be outside of that system. If we fail to address that, well, then we just fail to address everything else, including the enterprise of trying to leave those systems. I mean, let's be clear that in the United States Constitution, the 13th Amendment, what remains is not only the abolishment of slavery, but also what's been known as the punishment clause, which is an exception baked right in, which says, except if convicted of a crime. Now, most people don't understand this history in the United States. And so we wonder why mass policing is the way that it is. Mass incarceration is the way that it is. Well, baked in the very legal document that on one end liberates people from slavery is within the same document a caveat that allows states to police them in such ways that they can become convicted of crimes and then back into that system. You know, I want to be mindful of our time, but it is worth noting that when the 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865, it began at the beginning of the year, and it was Southerners from those former slave states, or at that time still slave states, that said, we want to put this in this amendment. We really need to have this convict clause in this amendment. And between the time in which that was negotiated and the 13th Amendment was ratified months later, these Southerners went back to their states and filled the law books with all sorts of crimes that could be if you were Black. Southern plantations actually expanded in size after the abolition of slavery, larger than they were before, because now is a whole different system of enslavement. And let me just close that part with just saying this. It's one thing during a period where abolitionists are saying, these are human beings who deserve personhood, equality, and not to be chained to these systems. It's another thing afterwards when Black people just simply become convicts. and lose their allies. And so when we think about what an anti-racist movement means and to think about it, we have to understand our origin story. And I want to make two quick closing points, which actually tie to Dr. King. One of the things that he said in 1966, two important speeches amongst many that he gave. One related to maternal issues. And Dr. King said when receiving an award from Planned Parenthood that it was cruel for children to be born into a world in which they were not wanted, and equally cruel for women to leave agrarian economies where it was normal to have 10 kids and then to be shoved into tenements that were 1 and 2 rooms. And he equated the civil rights movement with the women's rights movement. He said that neither resolved everything, but it was really important that we see the justice in both. And then also in that same year, Dr. King said of all of the injustices, inequality in healthcare was the most inhumane. And he actually said inhuman, but most people title that as inhumane. And I think it's really worth noting both of those. And finally, in that same year, Dr. King was asked, well, why are you speaking about so many of these different things, from reproductive health care and women to issues involving environmental justice and so forth? And he said because his moral concerns could not be cabined to just what people thought about in terms of civil rights. And I think that's right.
Of course, everything that both my co-panelists said, but also just, adding another level of being in maternity care exclusively. I as well do not like the anti-racism. I feel like people are starting to use implicit bias trainings as a checkbox, and 2 hours is not going to help people not be racist. It's just not. It's also continuing to tippy-toe and make pointing at individuals when, just like Ashanté said, it needs to be the systems that we're looking at. And also pointing out, like Dr. Goodwin said, look at the history of how these systems were built. So really we need to acknowledge the histories. We need to stop tippy-toeing. And so what that would look like for me is starting to address why we have such smaller numbers and a lot of different disciplines. Putting focus on the fact that let's talk about ability, financial to go to school, from also surviving programs, the amount of stress, microaggressions, and also discrimination that a lot of BIPOC individuals face trying to acquire advanced education. I could talk for days about how our maternity care system needs a complete overhaul, but definitely right now, provider systems are still not really doing the work. I think they're doing a lot of woke speak. It sounds like, they're doing something, but they're not really doing what's really needed to address how we got here and why we're here right now.
Dr. Wheeler, would you like to add anything to that?
Yes, I am on a panel with some incredible people. And what I'd like to say is, for me, it's accountability. It is not the flavor of the month. So that for this month, we're going to be anti-racist, or we're going to support our Black neighbors, or we're going to, this is for the lifetime. You're going to have to stand up, and you're going to have to be accountable even when it is uncomfortable. You're going, as we have said before, you're going to have to give up something. You're going to have some skin in the game. And unless you do that, next month when I come and I ask you about supporting Black maternal health, I don't want to hear that we have moved to another issue. We talked about that last week, or we had that, as Ebony said, we had that course 2 months ago, so we don't need to talk about that anymore. It has been addressed. I'm looking for accountability, and I think we're going to continue to be disliked, and people are going to be uncomfortable around us when we continue to ask for accountability. And that means change in the system. Oh, you guys are going to get me fired up. I'm going to have to sit tight.
We'll have some more time.
Be fired up.
Yeah.
Be fired up.
Yeah.
I'm here. We're all here for it.
Yes, and we'll have some time for you to get into that fiery ideas that you have shortly. But yeah, what I'm hearing from all of our panelists is this idea that anti-racism should be a continuing process, right? It's not a one-day thing. It's not something that you can get a certificate for or just achieve and then be done with it, right? And what I'm hearing is that having a process-based view is necessary due to the structural nature, the institutional nature of both racism and anti-Blackness specifically. And that requires us to constantly be checking our history, to be checking the institutional rules that may be biased against Black people. So those are some of the ideas that I heard. It looked like Dr. Goodwin wanted to say something.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you see an intersection of what we're talking about within the context of education. And clearly the power of education is incredibly strong, given that it was kept from Black people during the antebellum period. In fact, there were significant punishments, including the possibility of death just for learning how to read and write during the antebellum period. And then we see during Jim Crow, through separate but equal laws, the links to which states would go to deny Black children a fair and equitable education. So clearly that's really powerful. And it ties together with thinking about food too, because one of the things that is most painful is to hear about local municipalities moving forward to deny children breakfast and lunch because their parents couldn't pay for it the year before. What in the world could be more inhumane? The very notion that their parents couldn't pay for it before meant that they couldn't pay for it before, meant that these were families that were already struggling. And the idea that individuals would seek to deny children breakfast or lunch when for so many that is the meal, or those are their meals for the day, is just incredibly inhumane and also inhuman. But so much of this ties together to an education story. So long as we continue to deny our origin story in the United States, then we will see the kinds of conflicts that we saw playing out last night at the debates, what's happening in streets across the United States, the school to prison pipeline, mass incarceration, and in the backdrop of it all, the pathologies that tend to paint Black people and Latinx people as somehow being genetically inferior or having some genetic predisposition that leads to these consequences, but a failure to recognize the systemic structures from the very origins of American law that set these things into motion. You know, as I've recently said in a law review article, the very first cases in the United States that dealt with contracts, property, constitutional law, civil procedure, estates and trust, all of that was about legalizing, perpetuating the systems of human bondage of African Americans. And so our failure to address that in every way possible will only continue to perpetuate the kinds of inequities and inequalities that we continue to see in our society, which are not explained by genes. That's just a proxy for our failure to deal with racism.
Yes, thank you for that. And I'm going to actually transition into asking specific questions for each of the panelists, beginning with Dr. Goodwin. So just to build upon what you were already saying, you know, can you give an example of a legal aspect or how Black women have been criminalized and how that has influenced maternal health? And then also, what can we do about it?
It's a great question. So if you look back at it, there's a long arc of the criminalization of Black women and the fight for their own human dignity and personhood. But to tell a more modern story that many of our viewers today and listeners today can connect to, there is a perfect storm that came about in the 1980s and 90s with the rise of mass incarceration and the profitability in that, as well as the drug wars, and that combined with a nation targeting and surveilling Black women as quote unquote welfare queens. And in the wake of this perfect storm came about the targeting of vulnerable Black and Latinx women as crack moms, a horrific term, and then a horrific term labeled their children. And many newspaper articles, the New York Times, Washington Post, Rolling Stone, and many others that carried on this narrative. And even in revered medical journals, the Journal of American Medical Association, the New England Journal of Medicine, all perpetuating this hoax that there was this thing as the crack mom and that there was this thing as the crack baby. What we know is that reporters went into hospitals in the preemie wards and took video of babies that were born premature and said, these are crack babies. What journalists did were to write about stories saying this is a brave new world. These will be children who shoot up the classroom. These will be children who bring knives to the classroom and threaten their teachers and threaten their classmates. These will be ineducable children. Some went as far as to saying that children whose moms used crystallized cocaine during their pregnancies had malformed genitalia. Doesn't that reek of Jim Crow? Malformed brains and so forth. But then this legitimized the policing of Black women. And there are myriad cases within that period, and that sadly continue today, where Black women began being arrested for having stillbirths or for having miscarriages. And with coercive plea deals that they, agree to 10 or 15 or 20 years behind bars. Otherwise, there'll be even stiffer penalties. Prosecutors using laws that had not actually been put on the books for such things, but using drug trafficking laws to go after pregnant Black women, or using child abuse statutes to go after Black women. Hospitals conspiring with police and prosecutors in ways that had never been done before, again, to target Black women. And in the wake of this, there was medical research and science that was being ignored. And here I'll call to mind two doctors, Dr. Hallam Hurt at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School and Dr. Claire Coles at Emory University. Both had been studying for decades. This was their work, studying maternal fetal interface across alcohol, tobacco, cocaine, methamphetamine, all of that. And they had been saying, look, our data is not showing what you're reporting in the New York Times, what you're reporting in the Washington Post, what you're reporting in all of these other papers. At a certain point, they became blacklisted, meaning that reporters no longer wanted to hear from them because they were not helping to tell the story that journalists wanted to tell, which again subjugated and pathologized Black women. But in the wake of that, then what we saw is a dramatic rise like never before in the United States, the mass incarceration of women. So it's important to note that while the US incarcerates more people than any other country in the world, the United States incarcerates more women than any other country in the world. More women than in Russia, China, India, Thailand combined and toss in another country, right? And most of these women are Black and Latinx disproportionately, 2/3 non-violent offenders, and most of them in for drug-related offenses, and the overwhelming majority of them are mothers. And let me just close with saying this. As part of my research, I've researched on a number of continents involving myriad questions from sex trafficking to organ trafficking. And while I was in the Philippines, I met with the director of an NGO and was stunned by a story that she told me about her punishment being that her children were forced to be incarcerated with her. And what's so sad in the United States is that we've gotten to the point where children are incarcerated with their mothers as a means of good behavior, We're at the point where Sesame Street now has a character, Alex, a child of an incarcerated parent, because we've gone so far with this. So these are really important issues for us to address. And there are hundreds and thousands of women who've suffered this fate in the United States.
I really appreciate that perspective, because often when we think about the legal aspects of that affect maternal health, we think about access to care, right? The rules around who gets insurance or what insurance takes, things like that, right? But often we don't think about the criminalization of certain behaviors or perceived behaviors and how that influences health outcomes. And actually, Ms. Marcelle, you and I had a conversation about this years ago when we first met, about how certain rules in the healthcare clinics could lead to incarceration or lead to the criminalization of mothers, which could disconnect them from care. And so I just want to ask you, could you talk a little bit about what you've seen play out, or just share a little bit about your own perspective as a community-based practitioner on Black maternal health and maternal justice?
I apologize for my camera. My little baby is hanging out with us today. Yeah, so, the struggle that we have is marijuana. So complicating things, marijuana is legal, right? More and more in different states, which increases access. Folks have cards, but a lot of our policies are around marijuana being illegal, and they're very punitive. And so what I see a lot of the times is, unfortunately, I feel like women are getting tested in labor without their knowledge. Or their babies getting tested without their knowledge. I can't tell you how many moms are like, I mentioned maybe I used some in the first trimester because I was nauseous. And then all of a sudden, somebody came to see me on postpartum and told me CFSA had been called because they had put a bag on the baby and I didn't know. Something's inherently wrong about all of that. Not explaining anything to the mother, but also deciding that, marijuana, again, still in that place of like legal, not legal. And then the complications, that the risks that come with marijuana, the data is still not really clear. It's not really clean, but families are being definitely attacked. And it's really inconsistent. So we have some families who definitely get a home visit before they get discharged. Some families get a phone call, but we never know which way it's going to go. And I think for me, I really want to move towards harm reduction and talking about, especially with marijuana, like it's definitely a culturally, like a generational cultural mechanism in some spaces, especially with, stress. I'm not encouraging use, but I'm saying we have to find a way to help people and meet them where they are. And if they are going to use it, find a way to reduce or to find ways to make sure that they are safe. We got to put back harm reduction into the conversation as far as marijuana and maternity care is concerned. And instead, women are being faced with either trying to either not being transparent or being tested without their knowledge. And then that leads to, it continues to snowball. Then everybody in the hospital is telling them not to breastfeed, and then they're not breastfeeding. And we can have a whole nother discussion and conversation about what that looks like with women not breastfeeding. And so I still see a lot of challenges. And I know Michele has a lot to say about cocaine and other drugs. But marijuana, like it's very, very sticky here in the district. And we're facing a lot of challenges with that. Did I answer your question? Okay.
Yes, thank you. And that, again, brings me back to the theme of today's conversation, this idea of nourishment, right? How our structures can completely cut off the foundations of nourishment, like you were just talking about in terms of breastfeeding as one example of how we nourish our bodies and our children's bodies as well. I want to transition to actually Dr. Reese on your perspective on an anti-racist food justice efforts, especially you coming from anthropology and incorporating geography. I'd like to hear more about how you think of food justice through this lens.
Yeah, I thank you for the question. I will perhaps shift it a bit because I don't necessarily think about my work through an anti-racist lens. I think about my work through a Black self-determination lens, and increasingly more interested in thinking about food sovereignty, and thinking with, and hopefully we'll eventually write this article with one of my colleagues around Black and Indigenous food sovereignty, which I think is a conversation that happens and probably should be deepened. But so there are a few things that I think about, which is largely I think about organizations and people who are doing good work. And so last night, me and maybe like 15 other people convened as part of this working group of Black academics who do work on food and land. And before the pandemic, we were convening once a month, and now we're convening again. And I love, last night we just talked about like our freedom dreams. What is it that we want to see? And the thing that I keep getting stuck on is that I want all of our basic needs to be met. But I want so much more than that though, right? I want people, in this case, since we're talking about Black people, I want Black people to be able to relish in delight of the land, in delight of food, in delight of community. And so I think about how some of these structures eclipse delight, or make it so that we experience it in, pieces, or we're stealing away to experience it. So I think for me, part of what is missing often is I want us to talk about what is not just what does it look like, but literally what does it feel like to live in a world where Black people are free. And I think that is hard to imagine for a lot of us, right? And so I keep coming to this word delight, like that keeps coming back to me. But on the Black self-determination tip, I definitely draw from a lot of different scholars and activists here. But I think part of it is, again, making sure resources get in the hands of the right people. I always shout out the National Black Food and Justice Alliance because I love the model of how they do work. It's an alliance of organizations with Black leadership who are doing food and land-based work. And I love the way they think about how to make decisions and such. And I think that's important. And then, I think multiracial coalition building is really important too in food justice. One of the challenges, I think, is that sometimes I think folks want to skip over the messiness of what does it take to even get to a point where I can trust being in coalition with you, and I can trust that you have my best interest at heart, and I can trust that, this isn't about you checking something off of a list. And I think I get frustrated when the conversation goes straight to how can we work in solidarity? And my question is, what work have you done to get us to a point where we can work in solidarity with each other? And that work ain't got nothing necessarily to do with me. So there's that. And then I think the other question I often have, and this is actually quite particular to white colleagues and so-called or wannabe allies, I don't know what words we're using for this these days, but which is, for you, does collaboration mean that you have to be seen with me, or can you do some work in the background, right? And I think part of an anti-racist agenda, if we're going to use, well, we are using this phrase, is thinking about who needs to be seen and heard when and where. And sometimes that means that your work might be supporting on a background tip, and maybe it doesn't always get acknowledged in the way that you want it to be acknowledged. And that's okay, right? So I think about that often in food work. And thinking about Julie Guthman's work where she's talked about her white students, you know, being super interested, mostly white students being super interested in bringing good food to Black neighborhoods and communities of color. And she has a really good analysis of like, you know, what's problematic about that. And I think about, every time I read that article, I think if it were only students, but it's not only students, there are people leading organizations who are doing this too, right? And it makes me think about the education piece that I think in food movements, there is some misunderstanding of what types of education is necessary. And even approaching Black communities, assuming that I have to teach you how to eat healthy is already a problem, right? Or what Dr. Monica White is always talking about. So much of the work is approached from a deficit perspective, and like what happens if we think about the assets that communities already have, right? Let alone thinking about how much Black folks have contributed to US food culture. That's a whole nother story, right? There's skills, there's knowledge there. So, you know, I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but I guess what I'm saying is, I think in the food movement, to have a truly anti-racist agenda, we probably need to ask some different questions. So I'll stop there.
Can I add a couple of things to that?
Yes.
That awesome whole segment. I find it really challenging as well, just thinking about maternity, especially in maternity care, the blame narrative. I just want to be clear that some people want to use food as the reason why maybe her outcomes, you know, aren't the same, or that they're going to fix everything. The lack of cultural awareness as well, talking about the dynamics in a lot of Black households. Constantly when I'm teaching, when I talk to students, I'm like, listen, you can give her as much advice as you want to about how she needs to eat kale and lentils because you've decided that that's the best food, not understanding that maybe she's not the one who controls the kitchen, and not understanding about who's in charge of the kitchen, who's in charge of the food, and having broader discussions about TANF abuse and about how folks sometimes have to use their food stamps to pay the rest of their rent and survive, you know? And so just, there's a lot of points, just like, you know, Ashanté was saying, that people are not really talking about. And oh yeah, also, yes to joy, yes to thriving, 100%. And let's also, with that trust piece, acknowledge the fact that a lot of Black women have had their intellectual property stolen.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because that was one of the connections I was going to make between food injustices and maternal health injustices, right? What has happened to our ways of knowing and our ways of creating new knowledge, and what happens when our ways of knowing and being and doing things are vilified, but then years later come back around as a new trend, led by some other folks. So I did want to mention that. And something that I'm hearing from you all that's actionable is changing our language, right? Moving away from a deficit-based foundation of how we talk about social issues, moving away from a blame narrative and highlighting the strengths and the knowledge that communities already have. And that transitions me to Dr. Wheeler to talk a little bit about your work and your experiences working with DC communities to address hunger and food justice issues.
Whoa, okay, I'm gonna really try to just sort of, so in the District of Columbia, we have about 705,000 people. 16% of those people live in poverty. This is the nation's capital, the most powerful city in the most powerful country in the known universe. But 16% of our residents live in poverty. What makes me cry and keeps me up at night is that 23 to 24% of our children under the age of 18 are living in poverty. There is no excuse for this. This is ridiculous. So for the conversation today, I really wanted to talk about our use of WIC to make sure that mothers, pregnant women, and mothers up to the age of 5 are in fact allocated food. But then as I started, and I'm constantly pushing more WIC, but as I looked at WIC and I thought about racism, I started to go berserk, because as in most health things, the health and who decides what is healthy is based on white males. So it is so far away from where we are and what we can do that it makes me crazy. So I started with the WIC package. And the WIC package needs to be more culturally appropriate if you want mothers to actually use it. And the whole kale and lentils thing just sort of was absolutely true. We need to look at that. We need to think about who is telling mothers what to eat and how we're telling them what to eat. We actually need to be very specific. One of the pieces in WIC is that you must go to a doctor and it's medically tailored to you. But they don't pay attention to the fact that anemia is particularly high among African American women, or Latinx women tend more toward obesity, or what's going on with indigenous women. So it's just a one-stop shop. And I'm like, okay, how do we change those kind of conversations about it? $12 million comes into the district for WIC, but we do not have, our WIC participation rates are dropping. So I push federal nutrition programs because I want to make sure people have access to food so that they can spend any other money they have on their rent, on education, on transportation. But then when we start thinking about those things, you have no grocery store. You have no place to use your WIC. If I do get you on WIC in your neighborhood, there is no place for you to redeem it. So I am now giving you something and not giving you an opportunity to use it, and then being upset when you don't use it, thinking that you're just being belligerent. Oh, don't get me started. So it's that kind of conversation. We don't use the term food desert because when we use food desert, what people see is that there's nothing going on in those neighborhoods, that there are no resources in those neighborhoods, when in fact there are valuable resources in those neighborhoods. And what we get to do is we get to ask the neighbors, what is it that the residents, what is it that you want? Not what do I think is best for you, but what do you want, and how can I help you get what you want? So the other thing that I have to say is the median income in the District of Columbia, the nation's capital, is $85,000. Oh, so everyone thinks that's magnificent. I tell people, do not do the happy chick dance, because if you go into the numbers, you will find that if you are white, it is closer to $135,000, and if you are black, it's closer to $42,000. When people start the grocery stores, I stopped asking about grocery stores, because we tried to support grocery stores and they told us point blank, we have an education and income levels. And as long as you don't have the education and income levels, we will not be coming to your neighborhoods. My answer was, thank you very much. We'll do smaller footprint stores. We'll do community stores. We will go back to the co-ops that we had before so that we can have what we want. in our neighborhoods.
Jessica, may I jump in for a couple
Yes,
minutes?
yes.
I think, Beverly, thank you so much for mentioning about the education and income requirements of supermarkets and grocery stores. I think sometimes people don't know that, and it's a really important thing, right? Like, people always sometimes ask me if supermarkets are executives and decision makers racist, and I'm like, you don't have to have a race requirement for a neighborhood to still have racist implications around where you're going to be and where you're not going to be, precisely because of the intersections of race, class, redlining, and the geographic distribution of Black folks. So I think that was a really important point. The other thing that we haven't brought out specifically that I think is important when talking about maternal health is that it's not only poor Black women, that we see poor outcomes for middle class and upper income Black women too, which brings me to just a recommendation, and I can type this in the chat also. Dr. Naoyo Kwate wrote this article called Race Against Time, and in it she talks about time itself and time lost as a social determinant of health. And I think it's a really fantastic way to think about the cumulative effects of things like, I got to travel further to go access food, or I've got to travel further to take my kid to school because of the quality of the schools. And all of that, she's talking about the cumulative impacts of that. And then a second resource, one other thing I wanted to say about the grocery stores, it's not only just these supermarkets are saying, you know, we have these requirements, but city planning and budgeting, these institutions are implicit in this also. We saw this in DC when Walmart got these huge tax breaks to open all those stores in the district, right? Or and in some ways I don't know, empathetic is not the right word. I know that supermarkets often have a slim profit margin, and that's a whole nother kind of conversation, but cities often do a lot and offer a lot of tax breaks for these corporations to come in to supposedly care for their citizens, care in a way that doesn't happen, right? So I think one of the things we have to think about is how our city officials, our city planning, our city budgets are part of it. They're in on this in terms of when we're thinking about food access. It's not just the supermarkets themselves, but also like, what is the vision that these leaders have for our cities? We might think about that. And then lastly, I wanted to briefly mention, for those who may not know her work, Dr. Reese Harper, who wrote the book Sister Vegan, but has also done a lot of work on anti-racism and food movements and food organizations. I'll type her website in the chat, but she's working on a new book called Seeds of Sankofa, and she's taking an Afrofuturist approach to thinking about Black maternal health, and it's following these Black women maternal health advocates and activists. So knowing about her work and thinking about her work, and I am also thinking about the ways that we've been talking about kind of, you know, present and current realities, and I'm thinking about the ways literature and poetry and the arts and all these things can help us imagine lives that we do not yet fully have access to. And so just dropping that as a way of saying that, like, everything that we can imagine for the future isn't going to be found in our social science research, right? Like, that there are so many other ways that we can think about how to move toward better worlds.
Thank you for that. Yes, to everything that has been said so far. This has been a great conversation. And I want to transition us to a few minutes for Q&A from the audience. And so I'm going to pose some questions, and any of the panelists who feel compelled to answer, just jump on in. All right, so the first question that I have is, it reads this: I work in maternal and pediatric care. What I've seen firsthand is poor care across the board for everyone. Black women and children, of course, suffer the most in this system. It seems as though we are screaming into the void when trying to address maternal and infant disparities in health. How can we shift from making the issue Black folks and make it clear that the entire population suffers under a poor healthcare system and that addressing disparities among the most vulnerable actually helps everyone.
Well, it happens to be the case that Black women have been the canaries in the coal mine, and so have Latinx women and Indigenous women. And we see that in myriad ways, some of which we've described earlier today. But if we were to do a flashpoint just even now with reports that there are women in detention centers in Georgia who've been forcibly sterilized against their will, then we know that there's been a cruel history of that in the United States. When we see that children have been snatched away from their parents' arms at the US border and then put in cages, we know that there is a history and a legacy with that. And if we were to talk about forced sterilization, then we know that at a certain period, a third of the women in Puerto Rico had been sterilized. Some of this may have been voluntary, but a lot of it was likely coercive. We also know that a similar history exists with Indigenous women in the United States, and this was just simply broad spread with regard to Black women in the US. There was a period of time in which it was somewhere between 100,000 to 150,000 sterilizations that were taking place in the United States, many of that involving Black women. Fannie Lou Hamer called this the Mississippi appendectomy because there were so many, not just Black women, but little Black girls whose mothers or fathers would take them in because they had a cold or flu or something else. And within a day or two of having to stay at the hospital, were sterilized without their even knowing that. So it is absolutely right that if we can do this right, that is equitable healthcare, flourishing kind of healthcare, nourishing healthcare, transformative healthcare for the most vulnerable amongst us, then that is only better for everybody else. Because let's be clear, within a system that harms everybody, prior to the Affordable Care Act, and even still with it, we know that the majority of bankruptcy cases involves people not being able to pay for their health care. Women caught in a pre-existing condition spiral, paying more for their health care for the same kinds of services than men were, and even pregnancy or breast cancer, ovarian cancer, cervical cancer being treated as pre-existing conditions, meaning that after it happens once, you're paying out of your pocket. That's not all Black women. And so these are the kinds of systems that get baked in based on Black women, but ultimately establish a kind of precedent that allows it to happen to any woman, which is why it's really important and urgent that we have a more nuanced view of who and how people get harmed, right? And that harms to Black women are harms to us all.
Anyone else?
I was just going to add that I think it's really important for us to really acknowledge the history and how that history has shaped the foundation of our education training, and part of reason why things are not getting better. This is not a new problem. A lot of the disparities are not new. They're very old. There's decades of research looking at a whole bunch of different, thoughts of why, everything from education background, marital status, health behaviors, whatever. And we know that none of them move the pendulum for improvement. As a matter of fact, maternal mortality is getting worse. And we are the highest spending country for healthcare. And so, yes, all the systems are harmful to everyone. But I think for me, unfortunately, right now, especially looking at, like Michelle mentioned earlier, depending on the state, it's not just 4 times, sometimes it's 12 times the national average. We do need that targeted focus on Black women. And then having that targeted focus on Black women, we're going to have a bigger conversation of why, and that why involves racism and all the different facets that racism is causing, adding to this equation of why we have the disparities that we do. We can't be scared about talking about it anymore.
And I know that I wish to have open arms, and I do have open arms, and I really do want to just hug everyone. But right now, at some point, I have got to say, how long? How long do Black women have to die in childbirth? How long do we have to lose babies before someone stands up and says out loud, this is an issue that we are going to take on right now at this moment? And they can learn, okay? And that term "they" really makes me crazy. Others can learn, okay? Once we get Black maternal health, if we got Black maternal health down, do you know how many other people would absolutely just benefit from all the knowledge? So it's just that at this time, it's not that my arms are closed, but at this time, I want to call out and shout out our need to handle, to address Black maternal health.
I just want to chime in and say, I think this is where I take a lot of direction and inspiration from organizations that work in coalition with each other, because I do think coalition building in part means that I do not have to change my focus on Black people to work in coalition with people who are doing Indigenous land and food sovereignty, or who are doing Latinx land and food sovereignty. Like, it means that we are all doing this work. We have our stuff, and we are strategic and intentional about how and when we come together around things where our needs and interests intersect, or if we need to come together and support a particular kind of push, right? I'm thinking about how I was thinking about the example of the forced sterilizations in Georgia. I'm also thinking about last summer, a couple of summers ago, when the chicken processing plants were raided by ICE and 600 something people were deported. That's not Black people, but that is also something that is really important to the folks that I work with and think with, as intimately connected to also like any form of freedom and liberation that Black people are connected to, right? Like ICE as a carceral structure is intimately tied to other kinds of structures that impact Black life, right? And so I think the coalition building means that I can focus on those kinds of things that are related and immediate, that may not have anything to do with Black folks, when the time is necessary, and when it's something that we're building around Black folks, whether it's food, land, maternal health, that I'm expecting that those who I'm in coalition building with too can recognize the specificity of that, while we're also trying to figure out, like, are there ways that our issues intersect, and how do we enter through that space? But I think that's part of understanding how to navigate difference. We're not asking people to give up the thought that you need to focus on Black women, or we shouldn't be asking people to do that. That shouldn't be necessary to be able to think broadly around improving structures for other folks too, right? Like, and I think that's something that I think about and have some struggle with sometimes. And maybe this is something that we can, people can think about and talk through. But I do notice when I'm in spaces where we're specifically talking about Black folks or Black women, it is so easily for it to be a thing where we're talking about everybody. And I don't see that in other spaces actually as often. And I think it's worth thinking about how easily things related to Black women, Black bodies, Black people can then become in service to an all.
Thank you so much for the conversation about coalitions. One of the things we say at DC Hunger Solutions is we do not touch food. We never touch any food, but we feed thousands. And we feed thousands because we work in coalition with a lot of other organizations. We work to make sure that they have funding to be able to go off and do a lot of the community work that they're doing. But coalition building is really important, and thank you for that conversation about it.
Yeah, and I was actually going to mention that one of the questions that came in from the Q&A chat is, how can white, brown, and Black women stand together in sisterhood to address both food and maternal health injustices?
Well, trust has to be an important part of that conversation, and honesty. And I think that what makes these fractured and why we're still so far behind in terms of that deep coalition building, that seamless coalition building, some of those fronts, some are more successful than others, is the failure to bring the vulnerability to the table, the honesty, the history that's necessary, and pivot forward. I think we'd be remiss not to pay attention to the fact that within a number of organizations over the summer and during COVID, what we've heard is that there have been cases of race discrimination in sister organizations and organizations that lift up women's issues, but the suppression of Black women and Latinx women from being able to reach the highest heights within those organizations, the kinds of concerns that they wanted to have on the table, not being able to have a platform for those within those organizations. And the reality is that even as we strive to come together, sadly, racism still can plague sort of coalition building within women's organizations. And so to get past that, I think really involves dealing with these histories as well and being vulnerable and getting over it. And as others have said already today, being willing to take different kinds of roles. I mean, one practical thing that we can see come out of all of this is the sharing of space, that as women's organizations predominantly led at the senior levels by white women, but with many Latinx and Black women inside, that there have been calls for diversification when there have been panels where it's been, you know, all male or all white male. But the same has to be true within these movements as well. So just as a quick little tip, if you happen to be on a panel and it's all white women and you don't see any women of color, disrupt it and say that's not a panel that I want to be on, because Black women speak to these issues too, Latinx women speak to these issues too. All of that, you know, that's easy to do. But I'd also say that media also plays a role in this too. Just as we're having this robust conversation today in the wake of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing, so many of the individuals that media are turning to are not Black women, are not Latinx women, and they exist. And it's the same old kind of pivot, you know, and even men, let's talk to men about Black women's issues, right? That needs to stop, right? And so there are many more examples like that that could be unpacked, but I know that we're sensitive on time with other questions in the queue.
Those are excellent points, especially the points about the media and who we turn to for expertise. That's something I think about.
And one point on that still is fascinating to me, which is that Black women were the clearest voting population in rejecting what would become of the White House, right? 96% of Black women did not vote for President Trump. Now, what's fascinating in the wake of that, given everything else that we've seen, is that while, you know, there have been questions about, well, what did this mean for poor white people? What did this mean for wealthy white people? What does this mean for Latinx communities? What does this mean for, nobody's bothering, or there hasn't been a sustained engagement. What did Black women see? How come they knew something about this? You know, what were they scrutinizing, so that we can learn from the vision of Black women, the intuition of Black women, and that's been a lost opportunity by media organizations, and that should have been a quick pivot. We want to know why. What was it that you see? What were you concerned about? What can we learn from the way in which you voted?
Absolutely. Given the time, I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll wrap things up. So folks have been asking about the role of schools and education in addressing these injustices. We've been talking about. And one question related to that was, do you believe that more comprehensive nutritional education during school ends up playing a role in helping Black communities gain more accessibility for better health?
So I'm going to defer on the nutritional lens. But I will say that, so I was a middle school teacher before I was whatever I call myself today, right? And so, and I learned a lot from teaching middle school. But I think that really struck me with teaching these kids was that often we don't ask kids their opinions about things, and they are engaging the food landscape just like the rest of us. They see, they hear, they make decisions, they're making choices. And so I learned a lot from trying to understand from their points of view. But I think there's something broader than nutritional like education for me, and that's literally thinking about what is our relationship even to land and food production, and how it's not just kids. Most of us are alienated from those processes, so that the food that we eat is not only sometimes cheap because of the subsidies, but it is also cheap in another way in the sense that we don't always value the kinds of labors that go into it. So I think less about the nutritional piece, but I do think about the value of people learning, how valuable it's been for me, how valuable I thought it was for my students, and I think could be for other students, just in learning like how things grow, where they come from. I mean, I think lately I've been thinking a lot about how much we take the earth for granted. And I think we see some of the repercussions of that, right? And I would love for us to do more of this kind of teaching in schools as a way to counteract the kind of extractive logics that we have around the earth, around producing food, and more and leaning more toward an appreciation, right, for all who labor in getting us what we need. So I don't have much to say about the nutritional aspect, but I do think being connected to seeing, I think it's renting the veil, right? That food doesn't just end up on our plate. There are lots of processes that get us here. And I think that's valuable for all of us to take more of a look at.
In another life, I ran charter schools, pre-K 8. And one of the most fascinating things was actually watching the children work in the garden, where they could actually grow something. They wanted to cook it for you. They wanted to tell you about photosynthesis. They wanted to get their hands dirty. And it was really critical for them to understand that, yes, it doesn't always come in a box, that you too have the power to grow something, and that you get the responsibility of taking care of it, and you learn that you need to water it, and all of these things. And it often helped their parents learn too. So the children would then go home and say, well, I do want broccoli, when they go to the store with their mothers, where maybe they weren't buying broccoli before, but the kids had grown broccoli and they now knew how to cook broccoli, and they knew how to measure broccoli. We did a full where you just learned everything. You learned to spell broccoli. I mean, all of these things you could do in a school setting, and that's for all children. I think so.
And that reminds me of something that I saw when I visited Community of Hope, where Miss Marcelle works, and they had like an herb garden, like a community garden there. And so that is one way to connect these ideas between educating folks about food and educating folks about maternal health and nourishing themselves and their infants. And I thought that was a great example of bridging these two worlds together. And we are 1 minute out of time.
Can I add one more thing, Jess?
Yes, you could add one more thing.
More importantly than that garden is that we do group prenatal care centering, and we feed our mamas. And we try to use that opportunity to expose them to things that maybe they wouldn't normally be exposed to. So one of my favorite things is we have a fig tree, is giving our mamas fresh figs. A lot of folks had never tried figs before, even things as simple as like avocado, giving them fresh avocado, but using our groups to expose them, to things as teaching them as well.
Thank you. And I've seen that firsthand during my visits to Community of Hope, and it's really awesome to see. And so please join me in thanking our panelists for spending time with us today. And I just want to say that at the Antiracist Research and Policy Center, we're taking this conversation forward by formulating an anti-racist research and action agenda around both food justice and maternal health justice. And we're going to incorporate a holistic view of these concepts in our work. And so we look forward to building off of this foundational conversation, and please stay connected with us and build with us as we move from analysis to alliance to action. And so thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely.
All right, enjoy your day.
All right. That's perfect. Thank you.
Right on time.
Exactly.
Thank you all. This was awesome. I enjoyed spending part of my day with you, and so many ideas to bring back to my own work and to my students. And let's please stay connected around this work as we move forward. And I'm losing
Absolutely, love.
Take care.
Great. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye, Sean.